welcome back. As I mentioned last week, we've been doing for the past few years at Halloween time, rather than the usual generic audiobooks, readings of original stuff. Last year there was one from Elizabeth Lynn Blackson, but generally they're my stories, and I'm continuing that trend with the 3 weeks leading up to Halloween. Last week I did Green Crunchy Things, which I hope you enjoyed. This week I'm taking a story that it's been in several of my books, but Lifeblood 2 is the one that sort of stood out to me, which is a collection of vampire stories. So, as you can tell, this is a vampire story. It's called The Passage. His name was not on the official passenger list. He had bought passage for himself and his belongings without having to present the usual papers. While he could have used other methods of persuasion, money was all he needed for this task, and he had amassed plenty of that. He intended to adopt a new name on arrival in America. He'd gotten enough use out of the one he had at the time he boarded, so staying out of the official ship's records suited him well. He definitely had no intention of spending time with the other passengers, or even the crew for that matter. He would, of course, rely on some of them for his needs, but he had no desire to get to know any of them. Wilhelm Wolff boarded shortly before the ship left Cherbourg, France, on April 10, 1912, before it made its way to Queenstown, Ireland. By the following afternoon, they would be on their way to New York and his new existence. He had thought of going to the United States for some time, but numerous logistical issues had stood in his way. The speed at which this new ship could make the voyage helped to allay some of his misgivings about it. He had arranged with several of the crew to stay hidden in a storage room in the underdecks of the ship. It was a quiet, dark part of the vessel that greatly appealed to his needs. He didn't anticipate any trouble. Of course, sometimes we get things we didn't anticipate. The first of those things happened shortly after the ship left for open waters. Apparently there was a fire in the coal room of the ship. Well, there had been even when Wolff had boarded the ship. He could easily smell it, but he could also tell from the smell that it was somewhat under control. As the door to the storage room where he was staying burst open, it interrupted his rest. It was fortunate that the room was an interior one, deep in the bowels of the ship. Otherwise, some sunlight might have entered. As it was, just the artificial light from the corridor could be seen. A crewman, his lungs partly filled with smoke, his eyes polluted by soot, staggered into the room and slammed the door, trying to shut out the smoke in the corridor with that barrier. As the crewman began to get his senses together, he saw Wolff. "Hey, what are you doing here?" Resting Wolff answered, both truthfully and without revealing much. "Does the captain know you are here? We don't take kindly to stowaways." Rising from his reclining position, Wolff explained, "The captain doesn't need to know. Some members of the crew know and have been well rewarded to keep that information from the captain. Such a deal might work well for you, too." Getting more and more of his senses together, the crewman assessed the situation. He had made his way nearly to the center of the room by the time he had seen Wolff. He thought about the fact that he could use the money to send to his family. On the other hand, capturing a stowaway was likely to be good for his career. He made his decision. "No, I'm taking you to the captain. He'll decide what to do with you. Come on and don't try anything." He hadn't even finished the sentence when he saw a blur of movement. Before he could react, Wolff was standing between him and the door. "I'm sorry you made the wrong choice, but I can use the meal," Wolff said as he reached for the man. The sailor tried to scream out, but by the time he made the effort, Wolff was compressing his chest, so he had no air to expel his cry. It came out a weak whisper as fangs sunk into his neck. Once he had drained the man of blood, Wolff began to come up with a plan to get rid of the body. His first thought was throwing it into the fires that powered the engines. He quickly found upon exploring a little that it would be too hard to do that without witnesses. Even the corridor was hazardous because of activity of people trying to get the coal room fire under control. He decided to hide the body in the storage room as well as possible and wait until night. Then he should be able to carry the corpse to the deck of the ship and throw it overboard. Unfortunately, that didn't work as well as he intended either. He had easily hoisted the load over his shoulder. His heightened senses allowed him to avoid stairwells that were busy with people. Even so, he was surprised on a couple of occasions, but he had managed to quickly stash the man just beyond view in the shadows before the body was seen. When he reached the deck, though, it was packed with people. He realized that he would have to improvise. Listening and sniffing at doorways, he discovered a stateroom near the deck that was unoccupied. He decided to hide the body there, under the bed, and hoped to return later to heave it into the ocean from the deck. That decision, though, led to the next complication. When the couple whose room he had used returned for the night, they discovered the body and called for help. The ship's physician and command crew did their best to conceal the details of the discovery, but rumors of a vampire on board spread quickly throughout the ship in hushed whispers. Those rumors were going to make his stay more difficult. He would need to be less conspicuous and might have to move more often. Fortunately, as long as he stayed in the bowels of the ship, he could avoid the sunlight. While the stories of sunlight destroying his kind were strictly mythological, exposure to Sol weakened even the most hardy of his kind to some degree. Fortunately, he was one of the hardiest and oldest of them all. He hadn't achieved that distinction without a certain level of guile and fortitude. He would survive this too. He was sure of that. The crew were faced with their own problems. The coal room fire had been burning before they even took on their first passenger. While they had been able to contain that blaze, they had not made any headway at getting it under control. That issue was now complicated by the fact that the crew were looking over their shoulders constantly, hoping to spot a vampire before it sunk its fangs in. The command crew wouldn't admit that there was a vampire problem, so there was no official response. Crew members had formed their own scouting teams, though, searching the ship on their off time. As the word spread of the hunt for a vampire, the men who had secured Wolf's passage on the ship began to realize what they had done. They gathered together for a clandestine meeting. "You know it has to be him, right? Why do you think he came aboard at night?" "Well, he didn't want to be on the list. I just thought he was a wanted man. I had no idea he's a vampire. Who would?" "The question is, what do we do about it now? Should we tell the captain?" "Tell him what? We took money to get a bloke stowed away on the ship? How do you think that will go? We'll be lucky to never work again. We're more likely to find ourselves in jail. I don't want to go to jail, do you?" With that, Thomas Brown looked in the eyes of one of his conspirators, and then the other, judging their reactions. After a few moments of silence, Richard Jones spoke up. "Well, ain't none of us wants that, so we have to solve this problem on our own. I read Dracula. We need wooden stakes. We hammer them into the heart and put an end to him. Why don't we talk someone else into it? There are plenty of men looking for him. Let's tell them where he is. And how do we say we know? Either we're cowards who aren't going to do it ourselves, or they know we're involved. No, it has to be us." "Well, then it's us," Curtis Cousins declared. His fear was palatable as he spat the words out. They gathered some mallets and fashioned some wooden stakes in the ship's shop and made their way to the storeroom where they had secured Wolf's passage. Jones held a lantern in one hand and a stake in the other. His mallet was secured in his belt. His cohorts had mallets and stakes at the ready. As Cousins opened the door, Jones went in first to light the way. Brown followed quickly after. As they got into the room, they noticed that it had been rearranged. Mattresses, presumably from other storerooms, were lined up on the walls, stacked to the ceiling. There were wooden boxes and other small to medium objects strewn about the floor at random places. They had just gotten a few feet into the room when the door shut behind them. Turning to see what had happened, they saw Wolf standing in front of the door, menacingly sizing them up. "Gentlemen, are you coming to see how I like the accommodations? Did you not realize that I would know you'd be looking for me? Did you really think you could catch me unaware?" The men all stood for a few moments gripped with fear. None of them had been completely convinced of their odds of survival before they opened that door. None of them had wanted to do this, but they felt they had to. Now, what little resolve they had seemed to vanish, but it would soon be replaced by survival instinct. That would drive them going forward. Brown acted first. He lunged toward Wolf, raising the stake and pushing it forward as he readied his mallet. Before he even reached him, Wolf had dodged to the side. He grabbed Brown's arm and spun the stake around, breaking Brown's wrist as he did so. Wolf's other arm came around Jones' back and forced him onto the stake. As it plunged through his ribs and into his heart, blood rushed around the hole that it had passed through. Cousins screamed, "Help! Help!" Wolf laughed. "They won't hear you. Why do you think I stacked those mattresses up? Unless someone is just outside the door, the sound will be muffled to keep anyone from hearing you." His tone changed. "We have our vampire now." He paused for a moment after saying that. He hated that word. It was the one they would understand, though. He continued, girding himself to use the word as he needed going forward. Since he was killed with a stake, everyone will believe this man is the vampire for which they are searching. And there's more money for each of you if you continue to aid me. Once we dock in America, you go your way, I go mine, and no one is the wiser. Cousins leaned a little closer and asked, "How much money are we talking?" Rather than wait for the answer, though, he made clear in his motion that his feigned cooperation had been a ruse. He thought the shorter distance to Wolf would mean that he could get his stake to the target. He was mistaken. Wolf tore a gash across the man's throat. Blood and air began gushing out. Cousins dropped the contents of his hands as he instinctively reached to cover the wound with them. It was, of course, a reflex and a futile endeavor. His death would come quickly. Acting as if nothing of consequence had happened, Wolf turned to Jones. "Well, that means more money for you." Jones was standing with his mouth open, looking at Cousins' body as the life and color was leaving it. Wolf addressed him directly. "Look at me when I talk to you. You can't help your friend, but you can help yourself. He's done, but you can profit from this." Jones raised his eyes with trepidation and looked into Wolf's eyes. As he did, he felt his fear and anguish vanish. His will seemed to fade as they did. He was suddenly at peace and ready to listen. "Here's what I want you to do for me," Wolf spoke. "First, you will need to tell everyone of your discovery. Your friend here," he pointed to Cousins, "discovered the vampire." With that last word, he pointed to Brown. "He managed to get a stake into his heart, but not before his throat was slashed. You discovered the mess. You'll be a hero." I've already moved to another storage room. It's the one just across the corridor. I need you to make sure I'm not disturbed the rest of the voyage. I can't have any more incidents like this. I'll also need you to bring me some food at some point. We'll talk about that later. Once you've shown them your discovery, though, I need you to check on something for me. I know this ship is due to arrive Wednesday morning. I've had a few conversations with some of the crew, though, and I believe the plan is to arrive earlier, Tuesday evening. That will work better for me. I need you to check on that for me. Wolf looked at the man with both pity and contempt. Are your orders clear? Yes, Jones answered with an uninterested and subdued tone. Good. Then be on your way. Give me a few minutes to get back into my room before you alert them of this mess. Jones left the room and did as he was told. Soon a crowd was gathered just across the corridor from Wolf's chamber. The story was believable enough and put the whole vampire craze to rest. Bigger problems emerged before that one had resolved, though. At 11:40 p.m., there was a large jolt as the ship hit an iceberg. Chaos erupted as water began rushing into the front part of the ship. Evacuation procedures began shortly after midnight. Wolf realized that he needed to get off the ship. Hearing one of the crew ordered to man one of the lifeboats, Wolf stopped him and used his charms to get the man to give him his uniform. Wolf had lived hundreds of years. He could operate a lifeboat. The boat was loaded and launched into the cold sea before 2 a.m. Eventually, Wolf and the others on the lifeboat were brought aboard the Carpathia. The name of the ship brought a smile to Wolf, as he had lived in the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains for many years. Although he didn't believe in superstitions, he felt that it was a lovely irony that the ship bore that name. It was somehow more fitting that he'd be starting his new life by departing from that ship than it would have been had the Titanic taken him the whole way. By the time the Carpathia made it to New York City, Wolf had managed to get rid of his borrowed uniform and slip into obscurity. When he got off the ship to New York, he gave the customs officials the name of the crewman he had replaced. As soon as he left, though, he began to use his new name, Gunther Fleischer. He'd used his previous name for many, many years off and on. He'd change it for a lifetime or so and come back to it after a while. It had served him well. He felt that names have some importance, so he chose one that he would be happy to use for a long time. Much as he had with other names over the centuries, he could change it a little here and there, use a different one for a while in between, and seem to pass it to a son or grandson. It might perhaps last him longer than that, but only time would tell. All the money and belongings he'd brought with him were gone. They went down with the ship, as had the evidence of any kind of foul play being committed on the vessel. As to the money, though, when Wolf was declared dead, his European aide had already filed a report that he was missing even before he had left the continent. Wolf's will would bequeath his wealth to Fleischer, although there would be a few intermediate changes of ownership before then. He would just have to get by for a few years. America was the land of opportunity, and he was ready to take advantage of those opportunities in his own way. It was, in fact, a new world to him. Spooky Ventures is the home for spooky content and spooky merchandise on the web. Check it out today at spookyventures.com. And remember, always keep it spooky.